At 8:02 in the evening on Tuesday, March 11th, 2026, tonight, a single tweet from the Las Vegas Raiders account landed on every phone in America simultaneously. 12 words, no explanation, no context, no apology. Just 12 words that detonated the entire NFL offseason in one sentence. The Baltimore Ravens have backed out of our trade agreement for Max Crosby. We will have no further comment at this time. That was it. No follow-up, no press conference, no general manager walking to a podium to explain what had happened. Just 12 words posted at 8:02 p.m. on a Tuesday night, and within 60 seconds, every sports television network in the country had broken into whatever they were showing to tell their audience that the biggest trade of the entire 2026 NFL offseason was dead. That the deal everyone had spent 4 days analyzing, projecting, celebrating, and mourning, depending on which fan base you belonged to, was gone, void, canceled. Because Max Crosby walked into the Baltimore Ravens medical facility on Tuesday morning for what should have been a routine physical, the last procedural step before a blockbuster trade for 2 first-round picks became official, and he did not walk out with a clean bill of health. He walked out with a failed physical. And the Ravens, looking at whatever their doctors had found, made the decision that will define their entire offseason and ripple across the league for weeks. They backed out. 2 first-round picks that had been sent to Las Vegas were now coming back to Baltimore. A pass rusher who had posted a 12-minute, 58-second goodbye video to the Raiders and expressed genuine excitement about joining the Ravens, that pass rusher was still a Raider tonight. And somewhere in a war room in Las Vegas, a general manager who had spent $281 million in free agency commitments over the previous 48 hours on the assumption that Max Crosby's $30 million cap hit was gone, that general manager was looking at a set of numbers that no longer added up the way they had this morning. And across the entire NFL, in 32 cities, in 32 front offices, in every radio studio and television set and social media feed, the question erupted simultaneously. If not Baltimore, then who? Who gets Maxx Crosby? And in Cleveland, Ohio, in the facility where Jimmy Haslam has spent the last 72 hours rebuilding an offensive line and signing an all-pro linebacker, a different and more specific version of that question is already being asked. Could the Browns steal the best pass rusher in professional football? Should they try? And what would it cost them if they did? This is the full story of tonight's bombshell. And it begins not in Baltimore or Las Vegas, but in a place almost nobody in professional football ever expected to produce one of the most dominant defensive players of his generation.
Max Robert Crosby was born on August 22, 1997 in Lapeer, Michigan. His first name, spelled with 2 X's, comes from how large he was at birth. He weighed 11 pounds and 9 ounces. Even coming into the world, Max Crosby was already doing things bigger than expected. U.S. Embassy and consulates in China. 11 pounds 9 ounces. Even his birth was outsized. And the story of his life follows that pattern. Everything about Max Crosby has always been bigger than the circumstances suggested it should be. Bigger than Lapeer, Michigan. Bigger than Colleyville, Texas, where his family moved when he was 11. Bigger than Eastern Michigan University, the school that gave him his only scholarship offer out of high school. The school whose program had at one point been at risk of cutting football entirely. Bigger than the 4th round of the NFL draft. Bigger than every expectation attached to every stage of his journey. Crosby's mother, Vera, is of Serbian and Albanian origin. When asked about his Serbian roots on Instagram, he replied with the Serbian phrase, "Najbolji smo najjači," meaning, "We are the best, we are the strongest." U.S. Embassy and consulates in China. We are the best, we are the strongest.
He was not saying it as a boast. He was saying it as a creed, a statement of identity, a declaration about what the family believed about themselves and what he believed about himself from the earliest age. And everything he did on a football field from Colleyville Veritage High School onward was an expression of that belief, delivered not in words, but in sacks and tackles for loss and forced fumbles and the relentless, suffocating pursuit that made offensive coordinators around the NFL build entire game plans around the single question of how to keep Max Crosby from destroying their quarterback. Eastern Michigan was the only college football program to give Crosby a scholarship offer. He played 4 years for the Eagles, appearing in 37 total contests. He recorded 162 tackles, 16 tackles for loss, 20 sacks, 1 interception returned for a touchdown, 4 passes defensed, 8 forced fumbles, and 4 fumble recoveries. He finished his career ranked second in Eastern Michigan history in both tackles for loss and sacks. He became just the 3rd defensive player in school history to earn all MAC first-team honors in consecutive seasons. In 2024, the playing field at Rynearson Stadium was renamed Crosby Field, following a $1 million donation to the program from Crosby himself, U.S. Embassy and Consulates in China. $1 million to the school that gave him his only scholarship offer, the field where he first learned what it meant to play football at the college level, renamed after him because he chose to invest back into the place that had invested in him when nobody else would. That is who Max Crosby is, not just the pass rusher, not just the statistics, a man who remembers where he came from with enough precision and enough gratitude to put his own money into it. ESPN analyst Louis Riddick, after the Raiders selected Crosby in the 4th round of the 1919 draft, compared him to Jared Allen, one of the most feared pass rushers in NFL history. Not a compliment given casually, not a projection offered without conviction. Riddick had watched the film, and he said this player
But the beginning of his NFL career was not straightforward, because while Crosby was producing on the field, 10 sacks in his rookie year, runner-up for Defensive Rookie of the Year, numbers that nobody from Eastern Michigan had ever produced. He was living a completely different life off the field, a life that was accelerating toward disaster with the same relentless intensity he brought to pass rushing. Crosby was living a double life at the start of his NFL career. He later described it in his own words. I was doing well to the outside world. I was runner-up to the Rookie of the Year. Everyone's like, Max is killing it. But I was like wild as I was drinking, I was smoking, I was doing coke here and there. I was off the wall. I'd take a pill, I didn't even know what it was. It was scary. The turning point came when he woke up in his Las Vegas area home in a pool of sweat after prolonged partying. The hopeless feeling was overwhelming, but so too was the understanding that it was time to get help. 10 sacks as a rookie, runner-up for Rookie of the Year, and simultaneously doing cocaine in Las Vegas without knowing what pills he was taking. That is the full picture of Max Crosby in 2019, a player performing at an elite level on Sundays and destroying himself on every other day of the week. The gap between what the world saw and what was actually happening was as wide as any gap in the history of professional football. On March 11, 2020, with the help of his fiancée Rachel Washburn, his agent, and the Las Vegas Raiders organization, Max Crosby checked in to rehabilitation for alcoholism. He has been sober ever since. On March 11, 2022, the 2nd anniversary of becoming sober, he signed a 4-year, $98.98 million contract extension with the Raiders. March 11th, the day he went to rehab in 2020, the day he signed his first extension in 2022, and tonight, March 11, 2026, the day the biggest trade of his career collapsed in a Baltimore medical facility. Every significant chapter in the professional and personal life of Max Crosby has somehow found its way to this date. And on this specific March 11th, the chapter being written is the most complicated one yet. After getting sober, Crosby
the highest-paid non-quarterback in the history of professional football. That is the player the Baltimore Ravens were acquiring when they agreed to send 2 first-round picks to Las Vegas on March 7, 2026. That is the player who walked into their medical facility this morning and whose knee, repaired via meniscus surgery on January 7th, did not clear their doctor's evaluation. The key medical detail is this: Crosby underwent a full meniscus repair, not a meniscus trim. Those are 2 completely different procedures with completely different recovery timelines. A meniscus trim, where damaged tissue is removed, typically requires 4 to 6 weeks of recovery. A full meniscus repair, where the torn tissue is sutured back together, requires 3 to 4 months minimum. The Ravens knew about the surgery. What they found during the physical was something beyond what had been disclosed, or something about the repair that their doctors were not comfortable with, given the timeline and the financial commitment involved. Crosby's agent, C.J. LeBoy, issued a statement after the trade collapse that pushed back forcefully on any suggestion that the injury was more serious than previously disclosed. Max continues to be on track in his recovery, and if anything, is ahead of schedule, according to his surgeon, Dr. Neil Ella Trash. Max remains on track to return during the off-season program and will undoubtedly return as the dominant game wrecker he has been these past 7 seasons. Ahead of schedule. According to his own surgeon, who is, it should be noted, Dr. Neil Ella Trash, one of the most respected orthopedic surgeons in professional sports, a man who has performed surgery on some of the most valuable athletic bodies in the history of American sports. His surgeon says ahead of schedule. Baltimore's doctors said something different. And because the trade could not become official until 4 p.m. Wednesday when the new league year opened, because every trade agreed to during the legal tampering window is contingent on physical results, the Ravens had the legal right to walk away, and they walked. After the trade collapse was announced, Crosby posted a short video on his Instagram story of himself on a private jet. No caption, no explanation, no words at all. Just a man on a jet, destination unknown, sending a message that every person who saw it immediately interpreted differently. A private jet, no words, on the night his $10 million contract's trade value evaporated in a Baltimore examination room. That image, Max Crosby sitting on a private jet at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday night in March.
The fallout from the trade collapse is massive and immediately affects multiple franchises. The Raiders had spent $281.5 million in day one free agency commitments. Tyler Linderbaum at $81 million, Kwity Paye at $48 million, Quay Walker at $40.5 million, Nakobe Dean at $36 million, Jalen Naylor at $35 million, Eric Stokes at $30 million, and Malcolm Kuntz at $11 million. All built on the financial assumption that Crosby's $30 million cap hit was gone from their books. It is not gone anymore. His cap number is back, and the Raiders now have to figure out how to absorb it without collapsing the free agency structure they just built. Despite the chaos, PFSN projects the Raiders still have approximately $37 million in cap space, even with Crosby's contract back on the books. The verbal agreements made during the tampering period are not going anywhere, but the Raiders have lost trade leverage. Any team wanting to trade for Crosby will now offer less than the 2 first-round picks Baltimore had agreed to give. The window for a maximum return has closed. The failed physical has permanently altered his trade value. The Dallas Cowboys, who had been monitoring the Crosby market and as recently as 1 week ago were the gambling favorite to land him, are not expected to pursue a second trade attempt. Sources told ESPN's Jeremy Fowler that Dallas is unlikely to pursue Crosby again. They had already been unwilling to part with multiple first-round picks when Baltimore was willing. Now, with the medical questions on the table, the Cowboys have even less reason to engage. So, Baltimore is out,
Dallas is out, and Max Crosby, the highest-paid non-quarterback in the history of professional football, the man who has not missed more than 2 games in any season of his career, the 5-time Pro Bowler with 69.5 career sacks and more pressures than any other player in the league since 2019, is sitting on a private jet on a Tuesday night, with his trade value diminished, his next destination unclear, and the entire NFL world watching to see which organization is willing to look past a failed physical the same way the Cleveland Browns looked past Elgton Jenkins' failed physical 48 hours ago and saw a player worth betting on. Which brings us to Cleveland. Which brings us to Jimmy Haslam. Which brings us to the question that every Browns fan is asking right now and that Andrew Berry is almost certainly thinking about in a conference room in Berea, Ohio at this very moment. Let us look at the case. First, the football argument. The Cleveland Browns ranked 4th in the NFL in defense last season. They have Carson Schweizinger at linebacker, Defensive Rookie of the Year. They have Quincy Williams, former All-Pro, just signed. They have Myles Garrett, himself one of the most feared pass rushers in professional football, anchoring the defensive line. Now imagine Max Crosby on the other side of Myles Garrett. Imagine the 2 most productive pass rushers of their generation lining up across from each other in practice every day, pushing each other, competing, learning, forcing every offensive lineman Cleveland faces to account for 2 elite threats simultaneously instead of 1. The defensive line that Cleveland built around Garrett would become, overnight, one of the 2 or 3 most terrifying units in the NFL. Among defensive linemen in the NFL since 2019, Crosby ranks 1st in tackles for loss with 105, tied for 4th in sacks with 59.5, 4th in quarterback hits with 144, and 5th in quarterback pressures with 346. Since 2019, his 324 pressures are 40 more than the next closest player. He led the NFL in tackles for loss in both 2022 and 2023. The White House, 1st in tackles for loss over 7 seasons, 40 more pressures than the next closest player since 2019. Those numbers belong to a player who, when healthy, is the most disruptive defensive force in the sport. And the Browns' medical staff, the same staff that passed Elgton Jenkins when Green Bay would not, now has the opportunity to make the same kind of independent evaluation on Max Crosby. The Raiders are expected to explore all options. They are open to repackaging a trade. A Raiders source expected the team to be open to potentially repackaging a Crosby deal, while noting it is very early in the process. The fallout of the physical failure will likely hurt the Raiders' chances of getting 2 first-round picks in a new trade, but suitors will still exist. The question is what the new price is. CNN. The new price. That is the central question. Before the failed physical, the price was 2 first-round picks, the Baltimore Ravens picks in 2026 and 2027. That price is almost certainly gone now. The medical question has been raised publicly. The trade market knows what happened. Any team acquiring Crosby is now...
But here is where the reality gets complicated, because the Browns have real constraints. Cleveland's cap situation, after the Watson restructure freed $36 million, still leaves the team with approximately $18 million in usable space. Crosby carries a $30 million cap hit in 2026, even with restructuring options available. Absorbing that number while also completing the offensive line rebuilding process and potentially adding at quarterback or at wide receiver is a genuine challenge. $30 million for a pass rusher, on top of everything already committed, on top of Watson's unavoidable cap number, on a team that still needs to decide who the quarterback is and what it is going to cost to put the right weapons around him. The math is real. The cap space is limited. And Jimmy Haslam, the man who has been praised for the spending of the last 72 hours and criticized for the spending of the last 4 years, has to decide whether this is the right moment to be aggressive or the right moment to be disciplined.
The football answer says, go get him. Put Crosby and Garrett on the same defensive line and dare the AFC North to match it. Make the Browns' defense so dominant that the quarterback situation, however it resolves, becomes secondary to the question of whether any offense in the conference can move the ball against a unit anchored by the two most productive pass rushers in professional football. The financial answer says, wait. Says let the market develop, says let other teams make the first move, let Crosby's value find its floor after the failed physical, and then enter the conversation from a position of informed patience rather than reactive urgency. But there is a third answer, the Jimmy Haslam answer. The answer of a man who built his family's empire not by waiting for perfect conditions, but by identifying opportunity at the exact moment when other people were hesitating. When the Ravens backed out at 8:02 on a Tuesday night. When Dallas decided the risk was too high. When the rest of the league looked at a failed physical and saw a warning, Jimmy Haslam might look at the same situation and see a window. The private jet is in the air. The destination is unknown. The Browns' phones are on. And in a league where the difference between a championship and an early exit is sometimes a single player acquired in a single moment of organizational courage, the question is not whether Cleveland should pursue Max Crosby. The question is whether Jimmy Haslam is willing to do what he has done twice in the last 72 hours. Look at a player that another organization walked away from and say, we see something different. Come play for us. Tonight, the answer to that question is still being written.